Thank you. Well, I was pleased to have the invitation to speak to you this morning. I visited actually Lafayette-Orinda Presbyterian Church quite some time ago. And it's true that at least two delegations, I accompanied two of your delegations to the Gaza Strip, probably about 20 years ago. And we visited with the Atfalona Society for Deaf Children and the Ahliel Hospital. And those are two institutions that I know that the church took on as mission partner or partner relations. And I think you still have a relationship with the Atfalona Society for Deaf Children. I don't know the reality of whether that building is still standing. I know that the children, the deaf children of that classroom, lovingly referred to the LOPC classroom like this, because they learned sign language as deaf children. So I fear that it may have been one of the casualties of the war, but I just don't know. I think they're probably still functioning in some capacity, but I'm really not sure about the building. Anyway, as I said, I was very pleased to receive the invitation to speak to you this morning. And after I accepted, I got up one morning and just started writing. And in the space of an hour, I had tapped out 8 pages of information and things that were on my mind. And that was actually sort of a watershed because probably for the last 10 months, it's been very difficult to talk about the events of October the 7th and the events leading up to October the 7th and the events since October the 7th. So it was good to be able to put that down on paper. And yeah, that's what I did. That's what I succeeded in doing. So I think I'm just going to go through and share with you some of those thoughts, some of that information. And then at the end, assuming we'll have time, we can have a time for questions and answers, if that's okay. So again, depending on whose book you read or which source of information you read or follow, that will determine what you think and how you feel about the entire situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians and the Israelis. In other words, there are numerous books, resources, information that has circulated over the years about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is our job to sift through that information, to discern the facts, and to do our best to help, if possible, both parties to come to a joint or reach a joint and fair resolution to the conflict. I should say a just resolution to the conflict. Taking sides never helped anyone. However, it is our role and our duty to help where we can, and again, to seek justice for both parties and move in a direction that will help both parties to reach a negotiated settlement. I think it's also important to realize that in the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, you're dealing with two societies, two peoples that have been traumatized, historically traumatized. From the Israeli perspective, you're talking about Jews who survived they were the victims of Hitler's final solution in Europe, and both before and during World War II. For Palestinians, they were driven from their homes and their lands in 1948 when Israel declared its quote unquote war of independence. And Palestinians refer to this as al-Nakba in Arabic, which means the catastrophe. Some 750,000 Palestinians either fled from or were driven from, forcibly evicted from their homes in the wake of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and displaced and became refugees. And their homes were plowed under largely in order to make way for the new Jewish state of Israel. And since 1948, you've had quite a few conflicts every couple of years. 1948, the first Arab-Israeli War. 1956, the Suez War. 1967, the Six-Day War. 1973, the Yom Kippur War. 1982, Israel's war in Lebanon. Then you had the first Intifada, which is wrongly referred to as an uprising, because intifada is an Arabic word which means a quivering or a quaking or a shaking off. And that was the idea behind the Intifada. This was a young generation of Palestinians that wanted to shake off the Israeli occupation. So again, that was roughly from 1987 until 1994. Then you had the second Intifada, which was known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which began around 2002. And then 5 consecutive wars on Gaza since Hamas came to power in 2005, 2006. Now, it's a well-known fact, and you can look it up and you can Google it, that Israel created Hamas in order to counter the Palestinian or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and then later the Palestinian Authority. It gave Israel the excuse that we don't have a partner for peace. And in 2005, 2006, when Hamas came to power in Gaza, then it showed that the ruling Fatah party, which is based in Ramallah and governs the West Bank, that they were divided, and there was a division within the leadership. So again, by and large, this was the narrative that Israel gave, that the Palestinians are divided and we have no partner for peace. Managing the conflict rather than resolving the conflict has always been at the core of the current state of affairs. So in other words, conflict management, conflict resolution. Pre-October the 7th, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, was not, I don't want people to think that the situation was okay or that it was good, because it wasn't. And I'll say more about that later. And it wasn't conducive to moving towards a negotiated settlement between the two parties. The Israeli settlements and Israeli settlers, and that settlement movement began after the 1967 war, compounded the problem and is still compounding the problem today, depriving Palestinians of large chunks of their land and becoming basically and acting like a state within a state, all under the protection of the Israeli government and now the Israeli army. Again, I'll say a little bit more about the settlers and the settlement movement later. Prior to October 7th of 2023, the year 2023 was already surpassing and witnessing the highest death toll amongst Palestinians in the West Bank since 2005. So again, Palestinians were largely being assassinated, targeted, killed by Israeli soldiers, killed by Israeli settlers. And the language that's used is 3 terrorists were killed today, 1 terrorist was killed today, 5 terrorists were killed today. And that's the language that's always applied to the death of a Palestinian. They're always terrorists. 2023 also marked 20 years since the signing of the Oslo Accords and the beginning of that whole process. And the Palestinians were no closer to a state of their own or a homeland or a negotiated settlement to the conflict. For Israel, it was business as usual. And as I said above, it was all about managing the conflict and not solving it. Gaza had, since the election of Hamas, been cut off from the rest of the West Bank and laid siege to by the Israeli government. Israel controlled what went into Gaza and what came out of Gaza, and who went into Gaza and who came out of Gaza. In other words, Gaza was being punished for having elected Hamas to govern that enclave. And I was scheduled to be in Gaza again on October 10th, 11th, and 12th. And I had just gotten the last of 3 permits that are necessary to enter Gaza. You need a permit from Hamas, you need a permit from Fatah, and you need a permit from Israel, of course, in order to enter Gaza. And so on Friday, October the 6th, I had just gotten the last of those permits, and I was going to take the 2 pastors from the Church of Scotland, one from Jerusalem and one from Tiberias. And then, of course, October the 7th happened. So let me just say a little bit about the events of October the 7th. For the Israelis, by and large, they don't care, they don't know, they don't want to know what's currently happening in Gaza. All they know is that they want Hamas to be dismantled and to be destroyed. On that morning, Hamas operatives crossed the security fence, killing something like 1,200, 1,300 Israelis, taking 253 hostages, and wounding 3,300 Israelis. And many of the kibbutzim along the Gaza border were destroyed. The overall mood in Israel amongst Israelis is one of shock, trauma, anger, and now bloodthirsty revenge. They want Hamas to be destroyed. On Sunday, May the 5th, the Doha-based Al Jazeera network, if you watch Al Jazeera, I don't even know if you can get it in California. I would think you can. They had their offices raided in East Jerusalem, and they've been forced to relocate to Amman, Jordan, in order to broadcast and to continue to broadcast information about what's happening in Gaza. So it is only the Al Jazeera network that is broadcasting from Gaza. No foreign journalists have been allowed into Gaza. And again, this is another way that Israel is controlling the narrative, and they don't want the world to see what's happening there. The Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz, which in Hebrew means the land, reported that they reported that 1 in 4 Israelis would prefer to leave the country if they could. This was just recent that they reported this, and that's a staggering statistic. And actually, many Israelis have already left the country, and many more have said they would leave if they could. In the north, Israel is facing a battle with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and many of the settlements, and they're not settlements, but the communities, cities, and towns in northern Israel and in southern Lebanon have been evacuated. In terms of on the Israeli side of the border, that means something between 20 and 30,000 people have been displaced in northern Israel. They've moved down more towards the center of the country, and they've been housed in hotels. In the south, Hamas continues to show, as they did today, that they have the capability of launching rockets towards Israel. The southern communities have also been evacuated and are destroyed. I said that already. The Houthis in Yemen have launched missiles and drones towards Israel. On the morning of July the 7th, they succeeded in striking at the heart of Tel Aviv with a drone, killing 1 person and wounding upwards of 8 people. The fear is that the longer the war goes on, the chances are that this will become a larger conflagration and that other parties will be drawn into the conflict. I have mentioned here Iran, but Iran's already part of the conflict. But we're looking at Syria. Of course, Yemen is certainly part of the conflict. And now the fear is that the United States will be dragged into this conflict. On the Palestinian side, 9,700 Palestinians have been arrested across the West Bank since October the 7th and put under what is known as administrative detention. Administrative detention means that you can be detained for 6 months, up to 6 months, with no due process of law. That means no access to a lawyer, probably not access to your family. You don't have to be formally charged. And at the end of the 6 months, that administrative detention can be rolled over and instituted again. So there are many Palestinians that are being held in Israeli jails that have been under administrative detention for many years because they continue to roll that over again and again and again. Violence against Palestinians in the West Bank is soaring, mostly by Israeli settlers, but with the collusion of the Israeli soldiers, particularly amongst the vulnerable Bedouin communities of the South Hebron Hills in a region known as Masafariata, and also in the Jordan Valley. In terms of the statistics of dead, In Gaza, over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 17,000 women and children. And there are 21,000 children that have been quote unquote lost. That means nobody knows where they are. It is assumed that their bodies are under the rubble. But again, I think the death toll in Gaza will be staggering once aid agencies can actually get in there and start to clear the rubble. But it is presumed that they're dead. Over 96,000 Gazans are injured. 75% of the infrastructure in Gaza, that includes personal homes, public buildings, schools, universities, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency facilities, health clinics, and businesses have all been destroyed. The Palestinians of the West Bank now fear, and you may hear this from Reverend Munther Isaac when he comes to speak with you, that there's a real fear in the West Bank that this could happen here, because the world has stood by and largely watched this happen and allowed it to happen. And this genocide continues to unfold. The United States, and in particular the Biden administration, has orchestrated, paid for, and supplied Israel with the weapons and the armament used in this war. It's estimated that something like the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs has been dropped on the Gaza Strip. The people of the Gaza Strip were told to move from the north to the south of Wadi Gaza, it's called. Then they were told to move to the west along the Mediterranean Sea. They were recently moved back to the north, and now they're fleeing again to the south. Entire Palestinian families have been wiped off the population registry. The civilian population of Gaza has paid the highest price in terms of lives lost. On October the 7th, Hamas launched the surprise attack on Israel, centered mostly around southern Israel and on the Nova, you've probably heard this, the Nova Music Festival. This was a music festival that was going on about 2 miles east of the Gaza Strip. I don't know who thought that it was smart to have a music festival for young people on the edge of what is considered the largest open-air prison in the world, but that's where they were having it. And so, and again, I don't know whether this was part of Hamas's plan, or once they broke through the security barrier, they realized that this music festival was going on. In terms of the size of the Gaza Strip, it's roughly 46 miles long and 8 to 10 miles wide at any given point. It is considered to be the most densely populated area in the world. Some 2.2 million people call it home. 75% of the population are Palestinian refugees and their descendants from the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. On July the 7th, Israel finally revealed, and again, there were many that sort of knew this but didn't talk about it, that in the wake of the hostilities that broke out, they implemented what was called the Hannibal Directive or the Hannibal Protocol. Now, I had heard rumors about this, but I didn't believe it. But finally, they admitted it just a couple of weeks ago. How many, if just show me the raise of hands, how many of you know what I'm talking about, the Hannibal Protocol or the Hannibal Directive? Yeah. The Hannibal Directive is known also as the protocol or the procedure, and it was an Israeli military procedure aimed at preventing the capture of Israeli soldiers by enemy forces. So in other words, the directive was, don't allow anyone to be taken hostage. If you have to shoot, shoot. Shoot to kill. And again, because there's been no commission of inquiry since October the 7th, there's much more that will come to light, I think, over the coming weeks, months, whatever. But of course, we have to get to the end of the hostilities. So what is PCUSA doing on the ground here? first of all, I serve as the regional liaison to Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. So I serve 3 countries or 3 different areas. In the wake of October the 7th and its aftermath, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance stepped forward and empowered me to reach out to the Christian community in the Bethlehem, Jerusalem area and offer solidarity grants, particularly at Christmas time, to help alleviate economic suffering of the Palestinians. I think the first institution to receive one of those solidarity grants was the Al Hospital in Gaza. That's the only Christian-run hospital in Gaza. And again, that's one that you all have supported. The Presbyterian Church actually has an ECO, or Extra Commitment Opportunity account, where you can log on online and donate to the work of that hospital. So again, we gave solidarity grants to churches largely at Christmas time to help alleviate the suffering. Some of them did cash assistance. Some of them did food baskets. We basically left it up to the pastors to say, you know your congregation the best. Here's a little bit of money to help alleviate some of the suffering. Use it in the best way possible. In the months since then, we've continued to reach out in order to offer assistance to both Palestinians and Israelis who have been affected directly by the events of October the 7th. And I'll just name some of those. One of them is Sindiana of Galilee. That is an organization of Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab women that have come together and worked together and produced some of the finest quality olive oil that's sold in Israel. They also make olive oil soap. They do basket weaving, etc. And they have a visitor center in Kufr Kana, or Cana of Galilee. And they've been directly affected by the lack of tourism to the region. So we gave them a solidarity grant. We gave a grant to Hamoked. Hamoked is an Israeli organization which literally means hotline in Hebrew. And this is the organization to which Palestinian families go to or call once their loved ones have been taken into to prison or incarceration. So Hamoked takes it upon themselves to try to locate the individuals, and they open their cases. We gave a grant to Beit Salem. Beit Salem is Hebrew for in the image of, and that is the premier Israeli human rights organization. Again, we gave them a solidarity grant. We gave grants to the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, the ELCJHL, and the Al Hospital, I mentioned that. We gave grants to Dar al Kalima. This is the Reverend Mitri Raheb's University College, and to Al Hara Theater. Al Hara means the neighborhood in Arabic, to do psychosocial training. They were going into the schools in November and December to do Christmas plays for the children. And after the war, and when the Palestinian Authority and the churches agreed that this was not a time of celebration and all Christmas celebrations were canceled, the schools continued to ask Al Hara and others to come into the schools and do psychosocial training and drama for the children. So we wanted to support that. We also gave some funds to Arij, the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem, which is actually located in Bethlehem. And what they did is take people who were involved or employed in the tourism industry and started training them in hydroponics, how to grow plants using water. And again, the whole idea was not only to retrain them to do something different, but to help them grow vegetables, especially during this summer season when jobs were scarce, and this was a way of helping people to raise food. At the 220th General Assembly, which met in Salt Lake City, Utah recently, the Assembly passed 3 resolutions related to Israel and Palestine. Actually, there were 4. well, I'll mention the three that I've got written down. INTO5, which is on confessing our complicity of Christian Zionism. How many of you know what Christian Zionism is or what I'm talking about? It's a theology that basically, says that what's happening in the Holy Land is prophetic, and that God is ingathering the Jews, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can read more about it yourself, or you can Google it. But they did pass a resolution that we confess our complicity in that theology. The second one was INTO6, calling for educational resources for seeking ways to end Israeli apartheid. And this was at the 225th General Assembly 2 years ago. The Assembly voted to name that Israel's policies and practices in the West Bank constitute apartheid. And the one looking at now is FIN15. This was debated by the Financial Committee on calling on the church to divest from government debt held by countries maintaining a prolonged military occupation. So all three of those passed. I'm going to talk about 4 wows. I think there are a couple of wows that have happened since I wrote these down, but I'm going to talk about 4. The first one was on the morning of April the 14th, April 13th, April 14th, Iran launched a direct attack on Israel. In total, Iran launched more than 300 projectiles at Israel, comprising 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 120 ballistic missiles. And 99% of those were intercepted by air defenses or shot down by neighboring countries or by the United States. All 170 drones and 30 cruise missiles were taken down outside of the country's borders. Not one drone or cruise missile managed to enter Israeli airspace. The second wow is that on July the 19th, a long-range Iranian-made drone hit the city center of Tel Aviv in the early morning hours of Friday. It got through Israel's defenses. It slammed into a building. 1 person was killed and 8 people were wounded. That's wow. On Friday, July the 19th, the same day, the International Court, International Criminal Court, said or ruled that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is illegal. The United Nations representative, top court, said on Friday that Israel's occupation of the West Bank was illegal in an advisory opinion, and the opinion from the International Court ruled that Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. The ICA judges say Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are in violation of international law, and the court said Israel's obligation, including paying restitution for harm and calling for the evacuation of all settlers from existing settlements. That's a big wow. I don't know where that's been all these years, but that's a big wow. And the last one, you can probably guess what it is. We're talking about the same weekend. On Sunday, July the 21st, what happened? President Joe Biden announced that he would not be seeking another term as president of the United States. And Vice President Kamala Harris has been chosen to be the Democratic candidate to run against Donald Trump. That's a big wow, I think. Anyway, those are my 4 wows for you this morning. Now I'm going to go just to the current situation today, and I should be wrapping it up soon, and then we can have questions. So the current situation on the ground today is that tourism to Israel, to the Holy Land, to the West Bank town of Bethlehem has been decimated. It's estimated that between 60 and 70% of the town's people or residences living in Bethlehem depend on tourism in order to survive. So if you're a tour guide, if you're a bus driver, if you work in a hotel, if you work in a restaurant, if you work in a souvenir shop, if you own a souvenir shop, if you own an olive wood factory, or if you are a vendor selling things to tour buses, all of these people are out of work and have been now for 10 months. Palestinian day laborers have also not been permitted to return to their jobs in Israel proper, adding further to those who are unemployed. Only church workers and teachers have been allowed to cross the military checkpoint and return to their jobs on a daily basis inside of Jerusalem. In Israel, reservists or reserve soldiers have been told that they will have their months of call-up increased to 36 months or 3 years. The Israeli government has a plan to recruit ultra-Orthodox Jews to serve in the military. In 1984, Ben-Gurion, when he was the prime minister, ruled that yeshiva students did not have to take up arms and did not have to do their military service. But at the time, there were only 400 yeshiva students. Today, there are 60,000 yeshiva students in the state of Israel. So Israel is attempting to make it mandatory that Orthodox Jews serve in the Israeli army. I think I said earlier that 1 in 4 Israelis said that if they had the chance, they would leave the country. Some 60,000 and as high as 600,000 Israelis are suffering from PTSD and psychological distress. I'm going to end with just these two things. The first, I'm calling it the world according to Bibi Netanyahu. How many of you watched the speech? I think he got 25 standing ovations, didn't he? Anyway, in his speech to the joint houses of Congress on July the 24th, he provided no framework for a way forward, no timeline for an end to the current war and hostilities, and no end game or date for the release of hostages and the freeing of Palestinian prisoners. He sees Israel's goals as the US's goals. He sees Israel's enemies as the US's enemies. Our enemies are your enemies, he said, and our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory. He only named the Arab friends, quote unquote, without mentioning the names of specific countries such as Jordan, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, or Qatar. And at least with Jordan and Egypt, Israel has a peace agreement, but they were never mentioned by name. It was all words rather than accomplishments, and empty platitudes, and no talk of the possibility of a Palestinian state or homeland between the river and the sea, even though this is one of the first things Joe Biden said when he came to Israel immediately after October the 7th. He said there would be no going back to the status quo. Israel's war on Gaza comes at 10 months of the most significant domestic, political, and social crisis in decades, due to the legislation promoted by the Netanyahu government aimed at dramatically weakening Israel's judiciary and potentially rescuing Netanyahu from at least 3 possible corruption trials. My end thoughts are, there are roughly 7.2 million Palestinians living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And equally, there are roughly 7.2 million Israeli Jews living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. What is the future of these two peoples and this land going to be in the years to come? There are all sorts of other things I could talk about because the region is being affected by climate change. The temperature is getting hotter every year. It's already been stated that by 2050 and certainly by the end of the century, many of Israel's best beaches are going underwater because of sea level rises. So the region itself is already facing drastic changes over the next 80 years. I leave it to you to decide what the answer is, because I don't have it. And I don't want to say what my solution would be anyway, but if push comes to shove, I'll say it. But anyway, but I think the land needs to be shared. I think that there should be equal rights for all, and maybe that's a pipe dream, but given the current state of affairs, I don't see any other way forward. But again, we're dealing with one of the most right-wing governments in Israel's history, and it's clear that they've not brought peace and prosperity to their own people, nor have they brought a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think I'll leave it at that.